A millionaire humiliated a poor family in a luxury hotel in front of everyone. What the cleaner did left everyone stunned. The Grand Star Hotel, with its impressive and luxurious facade, gleamed like a jewel in the heart of New York City. Its crystal chandeliers, carpeted hallways, and impeccably uniformed staff created an atmosphere where luxury was the norm. In the lobby, sophisticated guests moved with the grace of those who belonged to that world, conversing in hushed tones, laughing discreetly, while admiring the artwork adorning the walls. However, among the elite who moved through this space, the arrival of the Parkers was like a discordant note. John, a middle-aged man with signs of weariness, entered first, followed by his wife, Martha, who nervously adjusted the simple dress she had chosen for the occasion. Emily, the couple's teenage daughter, hesitated with every step, her wide eyes reflecting the grandeur of the place. It was Emily's birthday, and the Parkers, with the tight savings they had gathered, decided to fulfill their daughter's dream of dining at a renowned restaurant. The idea of entering such an exquisite place filled them with apprehension. "Is this the place?" Emily asked, almost whispering. John nodded, trying to conceal his discomfort. "Yes, dear. This is the place." They headed to a discreet corner of the lobby, attempting to go unnoticed, feeling the weight of curious glances occasionally turning their way. Emily, though enchanted by the surroundings, felt out of place, as if she were intruding on a world she didn't belong to. She observed every detail, from the people dressed in expensive outfits to the golden glow that seemed to emanate from every surface. Meanwhile, the hotel's revolving glass doors opened with a soft noise, and through them walked Richard Montgomery. His presence was immediately noticed. Tall, with an imposing posture and a stern expression, Richard walked with firm steps as if the hotel were an extension of his own home. Dressed in a tailored suit and accompanied by 2 assistants attending to every detail, he exuded power and confidence. The hotel staff, who had maintained a posture of indifference until then, hurried to greet him with reverence, aware of the importance of pleasing him. Richard looked around disdainfully, as if everyone around him were insignificant. His brief, cold gaze passed over the Parkers without any acknowledgement, as if they were mere extras in his grand life. Martha, sensing the tension, whispered to John, "I knew we should have chosen another place." "We don't belong here." John held his wife's hand firmly. "And we're here for Emily. It doesn't matter what they think." Richard made his way to the reception desk, where a manager almost bowed in servility. "Is my room ready?" he asked, not even looking at the man in front of him. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery." "Everything as you requested," replied the manager, nervous. Richard nodded slightly, as if the confirmation was an unnecessary formality, and headed toward the private elevators, leaving behind a sense of coldness and superiority. Emily, who had watched the scene, felt a shiver. There was something unsettling about that man's presence. She wondered if the night held more surprises beyond those luxurious and intimidating walls. And so, with the tense atmosphere and expectations in the air, the Parkers' night at the Grand Star Hotel was just beginning, with fate preparing its own game among the opposites inhabiting that place. The restaurant at the Grand Star Hotel was a masterpiece of elegance. Glittering chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the tables, covered with white linen cloths, were adorned with fresh flower arrangements. The atmosphere was one of absolute refinement, where every detail seemed hand-picked to impress. The Parkers, still timid, were led to a table in a discreet corner, where they waited anxiously to enjoy the meal they had so carefully planned. Emily, though charmed by the environment, couldn't shake the nervousness growing inside her. There was something in the air that made her feel uncomfortable, a feeling that they shouldn't be there. As the waiter served the dishes with precision and care, Richard Montgomery appeared again, now in the restaurant, and upon seeing the Parkers, his eyes narrowed in disapproval. He couldn't stand to see people who, in his distorted view, didn't belong in such an exclusive environment. Seated at his usual table, he watched the family with a cold, calculating gaze. Throughout the dinner, Richard couldn't restrain himself. In a voice loud enough for the Parkers to hear, he began making sarcastic remarks. "Look at this," he said to the man sitting next to him, a fellow businessman. "It seems anyone can walk in here these days. How do they let people without class frequent a place like this?" The colleague laughed quietly, but the sound echoed in the uncomfortable silence that now dominated the restaurant. Martha lowered her head, trying to ignore the venomous words. But Emily, with trembling hands, stared at the plate in front of her, unable to lift her eyes. Richard, seeing his comments taking effect, continued. "It's truly audacious, don't you think? Bringing such modest clothing to a place like this. It seems they don't even know how to use the cutlery properly. They shouldn't waste the staff's time." A waiter, visibly uncomfortable, approached Richard to serve the wine. "Everything to your liking, Mr. Montgomery." Richard stopped him with a gesture. "Tell me," he said, making sure to be heard by everyone around him who allowed them in. He nodded toward the Parkers. "This is an affront to good taste." The waiter, unsure of what to say, just stammered. "They are our guests, sir?" "They should be more selective," Richard retorted, his words as cutting as ice. Emily, who had tried to remain strong, felt tears beginning to form. She looked at her parents, hoping to find some comfort, but saw only the same pain and shame mirrored on their faces. Feeling completely helpless, the young girl couldn't hold back the silent sobs that overcame her, her head bowing as tears fell onto the table. John, feeling unable to protect his daughter, squeezed Martha's hand under the table, trying to conceal his own suffering. Martha, her eyes glistening, held back tears, trying to offer some strength to Emily, but the pain she felt was overwhelming. The public humiliation intensified as other restaurant patrons began to cast curious glances, some with compassion, but many with disdain, as if the Parkers' presence was indeed a blemish on their night of luxury. Richard, satisfied with the damage he had caused, leaned forward, raising his wine glass in a sarcastic toast. "To exclusivity?" he said, smiling maliciously. The Parkers couldn't move anymore. They were trapped in a nightmare, where every second felt like an eternity, and every glance was a dagger stabbed into their souls. The restaurant, which once seemed like a dream place, was now a scene of torture, where suffering and humiliation were served as the main course. But that night, something invisible and powerful began to form inside Emily. Amidst the tears and pain, a feeling of revolt and indignation began to grow, silent but strong. Something that would forever change the fate of that family. And how unknowingly, Richard Montgomery had planted the seed of his own ruin. The atmosphere in the restaurant became heavy, laden with tension, and everyone, including Richard, awaited the Parkers' next move. But at that moment, destiny was just beginning to write its story, one that would be full of twists and unexpected surprises. The night advanced, but the heavy and suffocating air in the Grand Star Hotel restaurant seemed immutable. The tension was palpable, each second dragging as if time conspired against the Parkers. While everyone in the hall remained silent, watching Richard Montgomery's cruel spectacle, there was one person who could no longer endure what she saw. Sarah, the hotel maid, was nearby, quietly cleaning the corners of the restaurant, as she did every night. From her keen and experienced brown eyes, nothing went unnoticed. She had witnessed the horrific scene from the start, feeling a mix of indignation and sadness accumulate within her. Sarah knew well what it was like to be treated with disdain. Life hadn't been easy for her. Born into a humble family, Sarah began working at a very young age, abandoning her studies to help her mother support her younger siblings. Every day, she cleaned, cooked, and did whatever she could to ensure her family had the bare necessities to survive. Her husband, who had passed away years earlier, left behind a young daughter, Maria, to whom Sarah dedicated all her efforts. The job at the Grand Star Hotel was exhausting, but it paid the bills and allowed Maria to get the education Sarah never had. Seeing the Parkers' humiliation brought back all the memories of times Sarah had also been belittled, undervalued for her condition, and treated as if she were invisible. But at that moment, something inside her changed. She wouldn't remain silent. With determination in every step, Sarah decided to approach the Parkers' table. She knew her decision could cost her job, but she didn't care. There was a greater need within her, a desire for justice, to show that, regardless of her position, she had a voice and value. With the cleaning cloth in hand, Sarah began wiping around the Parkers' table. Her gesture seemed insignificant to others, but to the Parkers, it was a sign of solidarity. She looked at Emily, who was still struggling to control her tears, and offered a comforting smile, a reminder that they were not alone. Richard, who never missed an opportunity to humiliate someone, noticed Sarah's presence and immediately decided to exploit the situation. With a voice dripping with contempt, he spoke loudly, drawing everyone's attention. Hey, look at that. Even the employees have joined the undesirable party. What are you doing here, woman? This place isn't for people like you. Go clean the bathrooms where you belong. The silence that followed was crushing. Everyone in the restaurant waited, expecting Sarah, like so many before her, to bow her head and leave without a word. But Sarah didn't do that. She raised her head, her eyes shining with renewed courage. Richard, seeing that Sarah wasn't intimidated, approached with a venomous smile, expecting submission. But instead, Sarah did something no one anticipated. With a firm and clear voice, she looked Richard directly in the eyes and said, "You may have all the money in the world, but that doesn't buy character or compassion. There are things that even wealth can't buy, and one of them is dignity. I work hard to support my family, just like this family here works for theirs. We are not inferior because we are humble." The hall was in shock. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room, and for a moment, everything stopped. No one had ever challenged Richard Montgomery like that, much less someone he considered as insignificant as a maid. He tried to open his mouth to respond, but words failed him. The fury in his eyes was evident, but Sarah's unwavering calm disarmed him. She turned to the Parkers and, with a look full of solidarity, concluded, "You don't need to be ashamed of who you are. This place doesn't define anyone's worth. What defines us are our actions and our hearts." The once curious and disdainful looks of the other customers began to change. Some lowered their heads, ashamed of having witnessed and silently allowed such cruelty. Others began to whisper, admiring Sarah's courage. Richard, still stunned, took a step back, realizing that at that moment, his authority had been challenged in a way he never imagined possible. Sarah, however, didn't wait for a response. With dignity, she returned to her work, but the impact of her words resonated throughout the restaurant. And so, in that instant, something greater began to take shape. Sarah's courage not only gave the Parkers a respite, but also planted the seed of a silent revolt against the tyranny Richard Montgomery exercised over everyone around him. Destiny once again had changed its course, and no one there was prepared for what was to come. The atmosphere in the Grand Star Hotel restaurant was tense, still reverberating with Sarah's unexpected bravery. The looks of those present, which had previously been of disdain and indifference, were now filled with curiosity and restlessness. Richard Montgomery, the man who until minutes ago commanded the space with an aura of unquestionable power, found himself unsettled, trying to regain control of the situation. But Sarah wasn't done. The challenge she had thrown at Richard was just the beginning. Deep down, she knew that simply standing up to a man like him wouldn't be enough to change things. And that was when she revealed her trump card, something that could not only impact that moment but utterly destroy Richard's reputation. With impressive calm, Sarah slid her hand into her apron pocket and pulled out her cell phone. She held it firmly, aware of what she was about to do. The silence in the restaurant was so deep that you could hear the sound of the cutlery still on the tables, as if time itself had stopped in anticipation. "You think you're above everyone, Mr. Montgomery," Sarah said, her voice calm but loaded with unshakable determination. "But not all power comes from money. Sometimes the truth is more powerful than any fortune." Richard's eyes narrowed, his discomfort growing. He had no idea what Sarah was planning, but the feeling that something was very wrong began to overwhelm him. With a gentle touch, Sarah pressed the screen of her cell phone, and within seconds, the sound of a recording began to echo through the restaurant. The unmistakable voice of Richard Montgomery, arrogant and presumptuous, filled the air. "I'll pay whatever it takes to get what I want," the recording began, revealing Richard in one of his private conversations. "It doesn't matter who has to be taken down or bribed. My empire is untouchable, and anyone who dares to oppose me will learn the hard way. These people are just pawns in my game." Shock gripped everyone. Murmurs began to spread across the room, with eyes turning to Richard, who was now pale, as if the blood had been drained from his face. He tried to stammer something, but the words wouldn't come out. The audio continued, relentless. "Bribery? That's child's play for me. Manipulating contracts, buying judges, corrupting politicians. I've done it all, and I'm still here, more powerful than ever. And no one, absolutely no one, can stop me." As the recording went on, revealing the details of Richard's corrupt schemes to maintain his wealth and influence, The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from mere curiosity to a storm of revelations. Among the attendees were reporters who had been invited to cover a charity event, and now they had a much bigger and more explosive story on their hands. One of the reporters, a young woman named Clara, quickly grabbed her notepad and started recording everything she could. Her gaze was fixed on Richard Foss, who now found himself surrounded by looks of condemnation and surprise. The evidence Sarah had revealed left no doubt about the true nature of that man. "This can't be happening," Richard muttered to himself, his mind spinning as he searched for a way to contain the damage. But there was no escape. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The recording ended with a crushing silence. Richard's words continued to echo in the minds of everyone present. Sarah, still holding the cell phone, looked directly at him, and in that moment, there was no longer any fear in her eyes. The man who had once humiliated her was now helpless, his reputation crumbling in a matter of seconds. Richard tried to pull himself together, but his attempts were futile. He looked around, searching for an ally, someone who could defend him or help him out of this situation. But all he found were faces of disdain and indignation. No one dared to speak in his defense. The silent chaos that had taken over the restaurant seemed almost unreal. The elite present, Kyan, who had once felt comfortable under Richard's shadow of power, now found themselves exposed to the darker side of that man. And with that, the wheels of justice began to turn, slowly but inexorably, towards their target. "You destroyed your own life, Richard," Sarah said, her voice firm but without rancor. "And you did it through your own arrogance. The truth always comes out, no matter how long it takes." Richard Montgomery's fate was sealed, and Sarah, the humble woman he had so despised, had become the instrument of his downfall. But as the chaos unfolded, new questions hung in the air. What else would be revealed? And what would be the consequences for all those entangled in the web of corruption and lies that Richard had created? The answer would come soon, but not before more secrets were unearthed, forever changing the lives of everyone at the Grand Star Hotel. The atmosphere in the Grand Star Hotel restaurant was heavy, as if the very air had become too thick to breathe. The words that had come from Sarah's cell phone still echoed in everyone's ears, like an incessant echo revealing the rot that Richard Montgomery had kept hidden for so long. Richard, who had always prided himself on his unshakable control over any situation, was now pale and sweaty, his mind trying to process the disaster that had just unfolded. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair, as the eyes of the elite present fixed on him with a mixture of surprise, disapproval, and a hint of barely concealed pleasure at seeing the mighty fall. "This is a lie," Richard finally managed to shout, his voice trembling more than he cared to admit. "That recording, it's fake. Someone is trying to frame me." But his words echoed in the heavy silence of the restaurant, finding no support. Everyone knew it was too late. The damage was already done, and the truth, finally revealed, was impossible to deny. Outside the hotel, chaos was beginning to take shape. News of the damning recording spread quickly like wildfire. Journalists, drawn by the magnitude of the scandal, began to arrive in droves, surrounding the hotel entrance with cameras and microphones in hand, ready to capture the moment of the downfall of one of the city's most influential businessmen. Among them was Clara, the reporter who had been frantically taking notes in the restaurant, now leading the coverage with a determined expression and a gleam in her eyes. "Montgomery will be exposed tonight," she murmured to her cameraman as she adjusted her microphone. "Get ready. We're making history." Inside the restaurant, the tension reached its peak. Richard, still desperately trying to defend himself, looked around for allies, but found only faces that once feared him and were now watching his downfall with cold indifference. Those he had once controlled with his wealth and power now distanced themselves, fearing being dragged into the abyss he was about to fall into. Sarah, standing silently beside the Parkers, watched everything with a mix of disbelief and relief. The courage that had driven her to that point was beginning to turn into an understanding of what she had really done. She, a simple cleaner, had brought down a giant. But despite the fear that hovered around her, Sarah knew she had done the right thing. Hotel security, alerted by the impending chaos, quickly entered the restaurant. 2 security guards approached Richard, who was still trying to maintain his authoritative stance. "Montgomery, we need you to come with us," one of the security guards said, his voice firm but respectful. "You have no right," Richard roared, trying to resist. "I own this place. I'm in charge here." But despite his words, the reality was clear. The power Richard had flaunted had disintegrated in front of everyone. He was alone, his arrogance now just a pale reflection of the man who was once feared. The guards, firm but professional, began escorting him out. The eyes of those present followed every step, every movement, as if witnessing the end of an era. Richard, with his head bowed and shoulders slumped, was led through the hall, a man who had everything, and in a matter of minutes, had lost it all. When the restaurant doors opened, revealing the crowd of reporters and photographers outside, flashes began exploding in all directions. Richard was immediately surrounded, the questions screaming in his ears, but he had no answers. His mind was shattered, his reputation destroyed. As Richard was pushed out of the hotel, the sound of cameras and reporters' shouts seemed distant, muffled by the reality that had finally caught up with him. He tried one last time to protest, but his voice was lost in the surrounding cacophony. Back in the restaurant, Sarah watched everything in silence, her hands still trembling slightly. She knew her life would never be the same, but at that moment, a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She had done what was right, even if it meant facing someone like Richard Montgomery. Emily, who had watched everything beside her parents, approached Sarah and with eyes still red from tears, said in a low voice, "Thank you. For everything." Sarah, with a shy smile, just nodded, not knowing how to respond. The restaurant, which had once been a stage for humiliation, was now a place of justice and courage. And as Richard was taken out of the hotel, humiliated and devastated, fate continued to weave its web, paving the way for new challenges and revelations. The chapter closes with the image of Richard Montgomery being led out of the Grand Star Hotel, a man who lost everything he considered unshakable. And in contrast, Sarah, still shaken by her own courage, watched in silence, knowing that somehow she had changed not only her life, but those around her. The dawn of a new day brought with it a storm of unimaginable proportions. The news about the recordings of Richard Montgomery, unexpectedly leaked the night before, spread through the media like an uncontrollable wildfire, igniting headlines, news programs, and social networks. Richard's name, once synonymous with power and influence, was now associated with corruption, manipulation, and downfall. Major TV networks opened their news with the explosive story. Journalists and commentators debated tirelessly about the scandal's impact, bringing more details about the illegal practices Richard used to build his empire to light. Images of him being escorted out of the Grand Star Hotel were replayed in loops, accompanied by analyses of how one of the most powerful men in the country had fallen so abruptly and publicly. Experts in economics and business ethics were called to discuss the scandal's repercussions. A market analyst, with a grave expression, spoke on one of the highest-rated shows. "This is not just the end of Richard Montgomery's career. It is a devastating blow to all companies associated with him. In a matter of hours, we've seen stocks plummet. Investors are fleeing en masse. No company wants to be linked to this level of corruption." The effects were immediate. Companies with any ties to Richard began cutting ties, trying to distance themselves from the scandal before it was too late. Resignation letters from executives allied with Richard began to be published, and the shares of his conglomerate's companies plummeted at an alarming rate, causing panic in the financial market. The empire Richard had built over decades began to crumble in a matter of hours. While the business world was rocked by this earthquake, inside the Grand Star Hotel, the atmosphere for the Parker family had drastically changed. Still in shock from the previous night's events, John, Martha, and Emily were gathered in their room, trying to process everything that had happened. The fear and insecurity they had felt had given way to a sense of relief, mixed with disbelief at having witnessed something so monumental. It was at this moment that a soft knock sounded on the room door. John opened it, revealing the hotel manager, Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man with a formal demeanor, but who now displayed an expression of deep contrition. "Parker," Thompson began, his voice laden with sincerity, "I cannot express how sorry I am for what happened last night. The treatment you received was completely unacceptable and does not reflect our hotel's values." John looked at him, still distrustful, but let him continue. "I would like to offer you, on behalf of the Grand Star Hotel, our sincerest apologies," Thompson continued. "We understand that what was done cannot be undone. but we would like to try to make amends in the best way possible. We would like to offer you a complimentary stay in one of our best suites, with all expenses covered, for as long as you wish." Martha, sitting next to Emily, looked at her husband, surprised. They had never dreamed of being in such a luxurious place, and now they were being invited to stay in the hotel's most prestigious suite. The sudden change was hard to process. Emily, still absorbing everything that had happened, whispered to her mother, "It feels like a dream, Mom." Martha, with tears of relief in her eyes, just nodded. John, finally relaxing a bit, thanked the manager with a hesitant smile. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. We appreciate the offer. But more than that, we just want our daughter to be treated with respect, as anyone deserves." "It's the least we can do, Mr. Parker," Thompson replied with a nod. "We hope this helps improve your experience at our hotel." With a nod, the manager left, leaving the Parkers alone to process what this meant. The change in how they were treated was palpable. Where once there had been looks of judgment and indifference, there was now respect and kindness. The hotel staff seemed determined to ensure that the Parkers felt welcome and valued. As the family prepared to move to the new suite, the impact of the previous night still reverberated in their minds. Emily, who had been the cruel focus of Richard's attention, now felt a mix of gratitude and newfound inner strength. She realized that despite all the suffering, her family had emerged stronger, their dignity intact. Outside, reporters still swarmed, seeking new information on Richard's downfall. But for the Parkers, the worst was over. Now, they had a new opportunity to seize, aware that they had been part of something much bigger than they could have imagined. And so, as Richard Montgomery's empire continued to crumble, the Parkers finally found a bit of peace and dignity in a place where they had once felt only humiliation. Destiny, in its eternal dance, had taken an unexpected turn, and for the Parkers, life was beginning to change in ways they had never predicted. The glare of recent events at the Grand Star Hotel was fading, but for Sarah, the true protagonist of this twist, the journey was just deepening. While the headlines focused on Richard Montgomery's fall, deep within Sarah, old wounds and memories began to surface, brought to light by the courage she had shown. Sarah had always been a resilient woman, but the path that led her to that moment was paved with unimaginable challenges and sacrifices. Born and raised in a small rural town, Sarah knew poverty from an early age. Her childhood was marked by days of hunger, patched clothes, and a home that, while full of love, was constantly on the brink of financial collapse. Her parents, tireless workers, did what they could to support the family. But discrimination and lack of opportunities were insurmountable barriers. Sarah, the eldest of 3 siblings, felt the weight of responsibility from a young age. She learned to cook, clean, and care for her younger siblings while her parents struggled to provide the bare minimum. School for Sarah was a luxury she only enjoyed for a short time. The need to help at home was more pressing, and she left her studies to work as a maid during her teenage years. But Sarah was a keen observer, and even without formal education, she learned from life, from the people around her, and from the harsh lessons she faced daily. She developed a practical intelligence, a cunning that helped her navigate the difficulties that arose in her path. It was this same cunning that led her to notice something others might have overlooked: the opportunity for justice. Years later, as an adult and single mother, Sarah moved to New York in search of a better life for her daughter, Maria. There, she found work at the Grand Star Hotel, a place that, though luxurious, often reminded her of her place in society. However, she never let herself be discouraged. On the contrary, Sarah stood out for her impeccable work ethic and the dignity with which she performed her duties, earning the respect of her colleagues and superiors. It was on one of those long nights, while discreetly cleaning one of the hotel's most exclusive corridors, that Sarah overheard a conversation between Richard Montgomery and one of his associates. The cold, calculated words Richard spoke, detailing bribes and manipulations, were etched in her mind. In that moment, a flame of justice ignited in Sarah. She knew that if she confronted him directly, she would not be heard. She needed proof, something that could speak for itself. And so, with the courage life had taught her, Sarah began carrying her cell phone with her, discreetly and silently, always ready to record anything that could expose Richard. She knew it was risky, that she could lose her job, but her indignation at the injustice outweighed her fear. She recorded several conversations over the months, waiting for the right moment to act. That moment finally came the night Richard humiliated the Parkers. Seeing young Emily cry, Sarah could wait no longer. Her determination to expose Richard was strengthened by the desire to protect those who, like her, were seen as insignificant by the powerful. And so, without hesitation, Sarah used the recordings to unmask the man who thought he was above everyone. Now, with Richard Montgomery exposed and the news spreading like wildfire, Sarah found herself in the spotlight. But she did not seek glory or recognition. Everything she did was for justice, for those who had no voice. As she wiped down a table in the empty restaurant, the hotel owner, Mr. Harrison, approached. He was a man of rigid posture, known for being demanding and few words. However, at that moment, his expression was one of respect and admiration. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and solemn, "I want you to know that what you did here was more than any of us ever imagined. Your courage and integrity are rare, and they are qualities this hotel needs to value." Sarah paused, surprised by his words. Harrison continued, with a tone that showed the seriousness of his offer. I would like to offer you a position as hospitality manager. Your work here has always been exemplary, but what you did for this family and for all those wronged by Richard is something we cannot ignore. You have the vision and heart that this hotel needs, and I believe that, as a manager, you can do even more for our guests and our team." Sarah was silent, Harrison's words echoing in her mind. Being promoted to hospitality manager was something she never thought possible, especially for someone with her background. But at the same time, she felt it was an opportunity to make an even greater difference. With teary eyes, Sarah finally responded, her voice filled with emotion. "Mr. Harrison, I don't know how to thank you. I've always wanted what I do to have some meaning, to help others. If this promotion means I can continue doing that, then I accept with gratitude." Harrison smiled, something rare on his normally serious face. "You've already done more than anyone could expect, Sarah. Now it's time to continue this work in a new position. We are all proud of you." Sarah, now with a new responsibility, felt that in some way, all the pain and struggle she had faced in life had prepared her for that moment. She was not just the woman who stood up to Richard Montgomery. She was someone who, despite the adversities, never stopped fighting for justice and dignity. As the night went on, Sarah was alone for a moment, reflecting on her journey. She looked at the cell phone that had been her silent ally and put it in her pocket. She knew there was still much to be done, but now she had the means to make a difference in an even greater way. Sarah, the true heroine of this story, had shown that it didn't matter where you came from or the difficulties you faced. What mattered was having the courage to do what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Once again, fate had shown its ability to transform lives in unexpected ways. The morning after the tumultuous night at the Grand Star Hotel brought a mix of emotions for the Parker family. Still enjoying the unexpected comfort of the luxury suite they had been invited to occupy, John, Martha, and Emily found themselves in a blend of relief, confusion, and underlying unease. The hotel owner, Mr. Harrison, had offered them to stay as honored guests, a gesture that was exceedingly generous but also loaded with implications the family was still trying to understand. John, always cautious and aware of his place in life, worried deeply about how others might perceive them. He feared that accepting such hospitality might make them look like opportunists, taking advantage of the situation that had toppled Richard Montgomery's life. He sat at the breakfast table in the suite, his thoughts spinning, while Martha and Emily approached. "We can't just accept this without thinking," John said, his voice low but firm. "Harrison is being generous, but what if this backfires on us? What if people think we're taking advantage?" Martha, who was pouring tea, paused and looked at her husband. She understood John's fears, but something inside her was beginning to change. The experience of the previous night, watching her daughter being humiliated and then defended by Sarah, had left a deep mark on her. Martha was beginning to realize that perhaps they should, for the first time, allow themselves to enjoy something good without the constant guilt of feeling undeserving. "John," she began, gently placing her hand on his, "I understand what you're saying, but we also need to think about Emily. She's been through so much, and it's not fair for her only memory of this place to be one of pain and humiliation. Maybe, Just this once, we should accept what's offered to us with gratitude, without worrying about what others might say. Emily, who had been listening quietly, felt a lump in her throat. To her, the Grand Star Hotel had always symbolized a world she could never belong to. But now something was changing. The attention she was receiving, the respect and kindness from the staff, were beginning to heal the wounds left by the public humiliation she had endured. "Dad, Mom," Emily spoke timidly, "I know all this is strange for us, but I feel like maybe it's our turn to be happy for a while, without worrying about what others think. Sarah taught me that it doesn't matter where we come from. We all deserve respect." John looked at his daughter, seeing the new confidence starting to bloom inside her. Emily had always been a shy girl, and the events of the previous night could have broken her. But instead, something inside her had changed, and this filled John with pride and, at the same time, fear. "I just don't want you to get hurt, Emily," John said, his voice trembling, his paternal concern evident. "I don't want you to think the world is always fair, because it's not. People like Richard Montgomery might try to retaliate. I just want to protect you and your mother." Martha, sensing the burden John carried, moved closer and embraced him. "Johnny, we're in this together. We'll face whatever comes, but we also need to let good things happen for us. You've always been so strong, always focused on protecting our family. But maybe now it's time to let go of some of that burden. Let's accept this generosity and enjoy the time we have here." John took a deep breath, feeling the warmth and comfort of Martha's embrace. He knew his wife was right. Perhaps it was time to accept that sometimes life could offer good things, even to those who weren't used to receiving them. In the days that followed, the Parker family began to allow themselves to enjoy what the Grand Star Hotel had to offer. Emily blossomed, feeling secure and valued in a way she had never experienced before. She walked confidently through the hotel corridors, exploring the gardens and pools, even enrolling in a cooking class offered to guests. The staff, now aware of who she was, treated her with special care, knowing what she had been through. Martha, on her part, began to relax and allow herself moments of tranquility she hadn't experienced in a long time. She and John strolled around the hotel together, talking about the future and trying to leave behind the worries that still lingered over them. However, the shadow of Richard Montgomery still loomed. John couldn't ignore the possibility of retaliation. Although Richard had fallen from grace, John knew that men like him didn't give up easily. The authorities were investigating, but John feared Richard might try something before being definitively defeated. One night, while Martha and Emily slept, John found himself awake, sitting on the suite's balcony, gazing at the lights of the city that never slept. He thought about the future, the safety of his family, and what they would face when they returned to normal life. But at the same time, he felt a new kind of strength growing within him. Emily's words echoed in his mind. "We all deserve respect." In the end, perhaps this was the most important lesson. No matter what happened, the Parkers had learned that dignity wasn't something anyone could give or take away. It was something that came from within, something that no one, not even a man like Richard Montgomery, could destroy. And so, as the scandal surrounding Richard continued to unfold in the media, the Parker family, with all their worries and hopes, prepared to face the future with the certainty that together they could overcome anything. The experience at the Grand Star Hotel had changed their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. But one thing was certain: they would never see themselves the same way again. The fall of Richard Montgomery, once a titan in the business world, was swift and brutal. As news of his crimes continued to dominate the headlines, a thorough investigation began unearthing the dark secrets he had kept hidden for decades. The authorities, spurred on by public outrage, wasted no time. Every stone was turned, and the empire Richard had meticulously built over the years began to crumble from within. The initial revelations shocked the world. Bribery, contract manipulation, money laundering, the accusations piled up, each more serious than the last. But what had the most impact was the extent of his abuses of power, stretching over decades and affecting hundreds of lives. As the investigations progressed, the image of the ruthless business tycoon transformed into something even more monstrous. Richard, who had always surrounded himself with sycophants and allies who feared his power, now found himself completely isolated. The same men who once revered him were now scrambling to save their own skins, turning him in for deals with the authorities. He was no longer untouchable. He was a pariah. As he faced the legal consequences of his crimes, Richard couldn't help but recall the moments that led him to this point. Memories of his rise to power surfaced, like ghosts of a past he preferred to forget, but which now haunted him relentlessly. The flashbacks revealed a young Richard, ambitious and determined to make his mark on the world. He didn't come from a wealthy family. On the contrary, he grew up in a modest neighborhood where money was always tight. His father was a hard, cold man who believed life was a constant battle and the weak deserved to be crushed. "The world belongs to the strongest, Richard," he used to say. "If you're not the hunter, you're the prey." These words took root deeply in Richard. He decided early on that he wouldn't be prey. With a sharp mind and fierce determination, Richard entered the business world with a clear mission: to accumulate power and wealth at any cost. In the early years, his ambition was accompanied by a sort of moral code. He wanted to win, yes, but there were limits he refused to cross. However, as he climbed the corporate ladder, Richard began to see that the true players, those who really controlled the fate of others, had no scruples. They manipulated, betrayed, and destroyed anyone who got in their way. Richard found himself facing a dilemma: stick to his principles or adapt to the game he so badly wanted to win. The choice was made one night that still haunted him in nightmares. He was early in his career, about to close a deal that could change everything. The problem was he didn't have the resources to fulfill his part of the agreement. It was then that an older man, already hardened by the corporate game, made him an offer. "I can make sure this contract is yours, Richard. But there's a price. You must do whatever it takes, no matter how dirty, to stay on top. Are you prepared for that?" Richard, at the time, hesitated. But the vision of power and wealth that contract promised was irresistible. He agreed, and from that moment on, he began to slide down a path of darkness. That first bribe led to another, then to more complex manipulations, and eventually to a point of no return. He betrayed friends, destroyed competitors, and exploited the weak without remorse. His heart hardened, and his father's voice echoed in his mind every time he committed another cruelty. The world belongs to the strongest. Back in the present, Richard was alone in a cold, empty cell, awaiting the hearing that would decide his fate. He was unrecognizable, a shadow of the imposing man he used to be. His skin was pale, his eyes, once full of cunning, now displayed a desperate emptiness. As he waited, the steel doors opened, and to his surprise, former allies, men he had elevated to power and others he had betrayed along the way, entered the room. Their faces showed a mix of emotions. Some had barely concealed pleasure. Others wore expressions of cold revenge. They were the survivors, those who had learned from Richard to adapt and were now ready to reap the benefits of his downfall. One of the men, whom Richard recognized as a former business partner he had destroyed in a hostile takeover, slowly approached. "Remember me, Richard?" he asked with a cruel smile. "Oh, you taught me that in the end. Everyone gets what they deserve." Richard tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of his choices bore down on him, immobilizing him. He knew the business world was cruel, but he never imagined the end would be so lonely, so humiliating. As his former allies and enemies exchanged looks, making it clear they were there to witness his final downfall, Richard realized, for the first time, that his father's view of the world was wrong. The power he had sought so desperately hadn't protected him, it had destroyed him. And now, when he needed support the most, he was surrounded only by those who wished to see him ruined. The chapter ends with Richard facing the abyss of his own choices, as the faces of his former allies and enemies watch him, eager to see how fate will consume him completely. The justice he had evaded for so long finally caught up with him, and there was no escape. Desperation can drive a man to unimaginable extremes. And for Richard Montgomery, the fall of his empire was not the end, but the beginning of a new phase of vengeance. Isolated, stripped of his power, and publicly humiliated, Richard couldn't accept the idea of being defeated by people he always considered inferior. In the confinement of his cell, he brooded over every detail, every affront, until a dark idea began to take shape. Richard still had a few connections left, remnants of his vast empire, men and women who, though reluctant, still owed him favors or were loyal out of fear or greed. Using these connections, he began to orchestrate a plan to regain control, or at least cause as much damage as possible before being completely crushed. First, he contacted an old associate, a shady man with a network of contacts in the underworld. This associate knew how to find information, how to pull strings without being detected. Richard, on with his characteristic coldness, gave his orders. Find something on Sarah, anything that can be used against her. No matter how small or insignificant it is, if we can't find it, we'll make it up. At the same time, Richard knew that the battle for public opinion was crucial. Even with the overwhelming evidence against him, he hoped to manipulate the narrative in his favor. Using his few remaining allies in the media, he started planting seeds of doubt about the authenticity of the recordings. Small articles and subtle comments on TV shows began to suggest that the recordings might have been forged, that Sarah and the Parker family might be involved in a conspiracy to bring him down. The effect was immediate. Although many still believed in Richard's guilt, doubts began to grow. Sarah and the Parkers, who had begun to enjoy a temporary peace, started to feel the weight of uncertainty again. In the hallways of the Grand Star Hotel, where they once received smiles and words of support, there were now questioning looks and whispers. Doubt was a powerful weapon, and Richard knew how to wield it well. Meanwhile, the investigation into Sarah's past progressed. Hired detectives began to dig into every detail of her life, from childhood to the present day. They interviewed people from her old town, looking for any weakness, any mistake that could be exploited. However, Sarah's life, despite its hardships, was marked by honesty and resilience. But Richard, relentless in his quest for revenge, ordered lies to be created if necessary. The truth mattered little to him, as long as he could bring down those who had dared to challenge him. The atmosphere in the hotel became tense. Sarah, who initially felt victorious, began to notice that she was being followed. Unknown cars parked outside the hotel, and shadows seemed to trail her on the streets when she went out. At first, she tried to ignore it, believing it was just her imagination, a product of the stress of recent events. But when she started recognizing repeated faces, men who watched her with a look as if waiting for her to slip up, Sarah knew the danger was real. The Parkers also began to feel the pressure. Emily, who was finally recovering from the humiliation she had suffered, noticed that her father and mother were more tense, whispering when they thought she wasn't listening. John, always protective, started constantly watching the surroundings of the hotel, while Martha clung to her faith that everything would turn out all right, though her heart was heavy with worry. One night, as Sarah was returning to the hotel after visiting her daughter Maria, she felt a shiver run down her spine. A black car had been following her for several blocks, keeping enough distance not to draw attention, but close enough to be noticed. Fear began to turn into panic, but Sarah, determined not to give in, decided to confront the driver. With her heart racing, she stopped walking and turned to face the car. The shadowy figure behind the wheel hesitated for a moment, but then sped away, driving past her at high speed and disappearing around the corner. Sarah stood there, alone on the street, trying to catch her breath and regain her composure. But the message was clear: she was being hunted. When she arrived at the hotel, still trembling, Sarah was met by John, who was waiting for her at the entrance, worried.
"Sarah, what happened?"
"You're pale." She looked at him, trying to keep her composure, but the words came out before she could stop them. "John, I think they're trying to get me. Richard, he won't stop until he destroys us all." A chill ran down John's spine when he heard this. He knew Richard was capable of anything, and the thought that they were still in danger terrified him. "And we need to tell the police, Sarah. They need to know you're being threatened." But Sarah, always practical, knew that might not be enough. "And the police can help, but Richard still has resources, contacts. We need to be ready for the worst." The chapter ends with Sarah, John, and Martha gathered in the hotel, discussing the next steps they should take. The tension is palpable, and everyone is aware that the danger is getting closer. In the background, the shadow of Richard Montgomery still looms over them, a constant and relentless threat. The fate of Sarah and the Parker family is at stake, and the audience is left wondering how they will face this new and dangerous phase. The final battle against Richard is approaching, and everyone knows it won't be easy to come out victorious this time. The fear and tension that initially immobilized Sarah and the Parkers began to turn into determination. With the threat of Richard Montgomery growing every day, Sarah knew she couldn't keep hiding. it was time to act and act fast. She understood that the only way to win was by facing Richard head-on, using the same weapons he had tried to use against them: truth and public exposure. Sarah began gathering her allies. Clara, the reporter who had covered Richard's initial downfall, was the first to answer the call. Clara had always believed in Sarah's integrity and knew this story wasn't over yet. With Clara's help, Sarah started compiling a complete dossier with all the additional evidence she had gathered about Richard's illegal activities. These proofs, collected by Sarah and now organized with Clara's help, were undeniable and showed a pattern of corruption and abuse spanning decades. At the same time, Sarah contacted lawyers who were willing to take on Richard in court. They knew that, even with his public fall, Richard still had enough resources and influence to try and manipulate the system. But these lawyers, driven by justice and the conviction that truth should prevail, committed to supporting Sarah and the Parkers in this fight. While Sarah mobilized her forces, the Parker family, once fragmented and frightened, found new strength in their unity. John, who had always been a reserved and timid man, began to realize that protecting his family required more than just fear and caution. He saw in Sarah an example of courage and decided it was time to take responsibility and act. John began to actively involve himself in the plans to expose Richard. He attended meetings with the lawyers, helped organize the evidence, and even reached out to old acquaintances of Richard, trying to find anyone willing to testify against him. Martha, in turn, supported John and Sarah in all decisions, ensuring that Emily was also protected but aware of the gravity of the situation. Emily, for her part, surprised her parents with her maturity. The young girl, who was once shy and insecure, now showed determination to support her family and Sarah in whatever they needed. She began writing about her experience, sharing her story on a blog that quickly gained attention on social media. Her sincere and touching narrative attracted even more support for Sarah's cause, becoming a symbol of resilience and the fight against injustice. With everything in motion, Sarah's plan was set in action. Clara started publishing a series of reports that detailed the new findings about Richard's illegal activities. The articles were accompanied by interviews with people who had been harmed by him over the years. The media, which Richard had tried to manipulate, now turned against him with relentless force. Public opinion, once confused by Richard's attempts to discredit Sarah, began to see the truth. The tide was turning, and Richard, who once controlled everything, now found himself cornered. But the battle wasn't over. Desperate and with his last resources at hand, Richard organized a final attempt at revenge. He sent his men to intimidate Sarah and the Parkers, trying to force them to back down. Richard's followers started spreading rumors, attempting once again to cast doubt on the integrity of Sarah and her family. But this time, Sarah and her allies were prepared. The final confrontation occurred on a rainy night when Richard tried to use a pre-scheduled meeting between his lawyers and Sarah's to turn the tables. He planned to bribe Sarah's lawyers, sabotaging the legal process that was about to destroy him for good. However, what he didn't know was that Sarah, John, and their allies had already anticipated this move. With Clara's support, they recorded the bribery attempt, catching Richard red-handed, trying to use his dirty tactics one more time. When Richard realized he had been outsmarted, the hatred in his eyes was replaced by despair. He was surrounded, without allies, without an escape. The evidence of the bribery, combined with the entire dossier already accumulated, was immediately handed over to the authorities and the press. Within hours, new arrest warrants were issued, not only for Richard, but also for the few who still supported him. By the end of that night, Richard was arrested again, this time with no chance of escape. The last people who still supported him abandoned him, realizing that any association with him would only bring ruin. He had lost not just his freedom, but any remaining shred of respect or power he might have had. Sarah, the Parkers, Clara, and the lawyers gathered at the hotel after the confrontation. The relief was palpable, but there was also a deep sense of accomplishment. They had faced a powerful enemy and won, not by brute force, but by the truth and the determination not to surrender to injustice. John, who had transformed throughout this journey, looked at Sarah with gratitude. "You showed us that no matter how much they try to bring us down, we can always rise again." "Thank you, Sarah. You saved my family." Sarah smiled, finally feeling the weight of the battle lift. "We did this together, John, and that's what made us stronger. Unity, courage, that's what matters." the chapter ends with a sense of renewal and hope. Although challenges still lay ahead, Sarah and the Parkers knew they were now better prepared to face them. Richard's revenge had been neutralized, and with it, the shadows that once threatened their lives began to dissipate, giving way to a new dawn. The sun shone with renewed light over New York, as if even nature wanted to witness the conclusion of a saga of justice and redemption that had captured everyone's attention. The trial of Richard Montgomery was the most anticipated event of the year, with courtrooms packed and cameras ready to record what would be the end of an era of corruption and abuse. In court, Richard sat silently, a man who had once been feared and revered, now just a shadow of his former self. The evidence against him was overwhelming, accumulated over months of investigations and reports. Each testimony, each document presented, pushed Richard further into the abyss of condemnation. When the verdict was finally read, there were no surprises. Richard Montgomery was found guilty of a series of crimes, including bribery, corruption, abuse of power, and attempted intimidation. The sentence was severe, decades in prison, without the possibility of parole. Everything he had built dishonestly was dismantled, his assets seized, and his name, once a symbol of power, now synonymous with shame. For Sarah, watching Richard's downfall didn't bring the bitter satisfaction that many might expect. Instead, she felt a profound sense of justice and relief. The battle had been long and hard, but it was finally over. She could at last breathe easily, knowing the danger was gone. Sarah's new life began the day after Richard's sentencing. Now a respected public figure, Sarah was officially appointed as the hospitality manager of the Grand Star Hotel. Her story of courage and integrity had inspired many, and she was often hailed as an example of how an ordinary person can make a difference when they refuse to accept injustice. Under Sarah's leadership, the Grand Star Hotel began to transform. She brought with her not only her experience and work ethic, but also a deep sense of compassion and respect for everyone, from employees to guests. Under her direction, the hotel flourished like never before, becoming known not just for its luxury but for the dignity with which it treated everyone who walked through its doors. As Sarah took on her new role, the Parker family also began writing a new chapter in their lives. The ordeal they faced together had bonded them indestructibly, and with Sarah's help and the friends they made along the way, they decided it was time to move on. John and Martha, now stronger and wiser, found new job opportunities that would allow them to support the family more securely. Emily, revitalized by the experience and the support she received, decided to go back to school with a new sense of purpose and determination. Before they left, the hotel owner, Mr. Harrisonine, organized a party in honor of Sarah and the Parkers. The Grand Star's ballroom was filled with lights, soft music, and genuine smiles. Employees, friends, and even former guests came to celebrate the victory of justice and integrity over corruption and fear. It was a moment of celebration, but also of reflection on everything that had happened. During the party, Sarah took the stage to give a brief speech. This wasn't just my victory," she said, her voice full of emotion. It was a victory for everyone who refuses to accept injustice, who believes that no matter how small or insignificant they may seem, their actions have power. We fought together, and together we won. The applause was deafening, and Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for all who supported her. She knew that although the battle had been difficult, the outcome proved that dignity and courage could prevail, even against the darkest forces. As the night went on, Sarah stepped aside for a moment to take in the view of the illuminated city. It was then that Clara, the reporter who had accompanied her throughout the journey, approached with a curious look. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you that I discovered recently," she said with a mysterious tone. Clara then revealed that during her investigations, she discovered that Sarah had been anonymously helped by a powerful person who had personal reasons for wanting to see Richard fall. This person, preferring to stay in the shadows, had ensured that additional evidence reached the right hands and that the truth was protected until the end. Sarah was surprised, but at the same time, not entirely shocked. She had always felt there was something more, a greater force at play. Perhaps even in the shadows, there were people who, like her, were willing to fight for justice, no matter the cost. The final chapter ends with Sarah gazing at the city lights, a serene smile on her face. The powerful message of dignity, courage, and the importance of fighting against injustice, regardless of its origin, resonated in her heart. Justice had found its way, and life, despite all the challenges, moved forward with the promise of better days. Sarah's story, the Parkers, and everyone who stood up to Richard Montgomery serve as a reminder that even when it seems like evil is about to win, truth and integrity have unmatched power. And even in the shadows, justice always finds a way.